Hello. Today we'll be going over this paper by Suzanne Zerais and Petra Jansen. Apologies if I've mispronounced those names. And it's about the effects of physical activity on executive function and motor performance in children with ADHD. The elevator pitch of this paper is that exercise results in improved cognitive performance, namely working memory performance, in children with ADHD. And if you want to know more about this paper, about the methodology, and my criticisms, feel free to stick around. In the abstract, it's noted that physical activity has been demonstrated to improve cognitive functioning in healthy populations. Populations. And the purpose of this study was to determine whether physical activity improves cognitive performance in children with ADHD. The sample size was 43 children, and they were split into three groups. One was exercise group 1, which focused on the abilities of ball handling, balance, and manual dexterity. And exercise group 2 were trained in sports without a specific focus. And finally, there was a control group that received no intervention. And this experiment was performed over a 12-week period. And they did find that several measures of the exercise group 1 and 2 subjects significantly improved over time. And significantly here meaning statistically significant. Finally, they conclude the abstract by saying that the outcomes indicated that regular physical activity can be used as a complementary or alternative non-pharmacologic treatment for ADHD. That's a very strong statement. I'll get to that at the end when I discuss the limitations. But let's get to it. All right, so this introduction is incredibly detailed. There is an extensive amount of work that has been done on understanding the effects of physical activity on improving the working memory abilities of children with ADHD. And in particular, what the authors of this paper did in the past, in the 2014 study, was to establish the correlation between individual executive function domains and the motor abilities. So the executive function domains refer to action, memory, emotion, effort, focus, and activation. And I just got that from I just Googled executive function domains, and there was just this image at this website. So they established that using several metrics, most of which I will talk about a little bit today. And these are, I'll get to those later, but using these tests, they were able to establish that for the most part, different working memory tasks, but not inhibition control, were relevant to motor performance. And so that's why they only focus on the specific tasks that they focus on in this paper. Okay. And in particular, working memory performance is connected to the motor abilities catching and aiming, manual dexterity, and balance. No relationship was found between inhibition control and motor performance. Okay. And inhibition control here actually refers to a task where you're given a particular color flashes, I think green, and if occasionally it flashes red, in which case you have to not respond. So if it flashes green, you press the space bar, and if it flashes red, you don't press the space bar. So that's what they mean by inhibition control here. Not the colloquial sense, I thought, where you're given like a food reward, and if you wait 30 minutes, you can have more food, but if you eat it now, you don't get the reward later. So just wanted to clarify that for you guys. And the next section is basically a very large gap statement. And this is something that I was stuck on for a little bit when I was starting to read the paper. And what's really nice about peer-reviewed studies, the consistent benefit of peer-reviewed studies in reputable journals, is that you can be sure that the study you're reading does fit into the larger discussion, the larger research discussion at large. So the results themselves might be questionable, the methodology might be questionable. In this paper, I think it's more or less fine. But for someone like me outside the field, I can rest assured that the literature review they've done is extensive and relevant, and the results they propose does fit into a gap in the literature. Okay. Now, this is their hypothesis. Executive function is related to motor skills and physical activity. We can hypothesize that improved motor abilities or an increased physical activity could lead to enhanced executive function. So pretty reasonable. And again, there have been lots of studies related to executive function and motor abilities and physical activity, but specifically this paper sought to look at different types of motor activity and specific executive function domains. Okay, we consider the question whether the kind of physical activity has an impact on these effects. Based on the correlations found in our previous research, we focused on training of catching and aiming, balance, and manual dexterity for one of the experimental groups, EG1. The physical activity program of the second group included sports with low demands on the mentioned abilities. So effectively the physical activities are disjoint. So they are testing different things in the two exercise groups. Materials and methods. A sample of 43 children diagnosed with ADHD were used. To me, this seems like a pretty small number, but it does at the same time seem like it is a standard number to have a few dozen. So we saw this in the Zemetkin et al. 1991 study. We saw this in the meta study that I looked at recently. A lot of those studies did have on the order of a few dozen, and there were a few exceptions that had 100 or 1,000 subjects. But again, those seem to be more of the exception than the rule. A nice thing about this study is that they were very careful to screen each child for ADHD. So they had a child psychiatrist make a medical diagnosis of ADHD using ICD-10. I don't know the details of this particular classification, but the reference is right there. And they also performed clinical interviews with children, parents, and teachers and used rating scales like this, I assume aptly named test, as well as this other aptly named test, which I absolutely cannot pronounce. And this also might be why the sample size was relatively small. There's limited time and money to do these things, and they're being as careful as they possibly can given those constraints. And so, 43 children, that's pretty reasonable. Moreover, they're very careful to remove confounds. So none of the children were treated with stimulant medication, and children with an IQ of less than 85, gross sensory or motor problems, the diagnosis of mental retardation rather than the diagnosis of autism, schizophrenia, epilepsy, or the history of other neurological problems were excluded from the study. Okay, and groups did not differ significantly in age, BMI, and weekly hours of sports activities. And I think this must be a problem with these studies that include subjects. If you're removing as many confounding factors as possible and screening for the specific type of disorder that you want to understand, then it really limits the subject pool. So that might be a reason why the sample size is relatively small. Something I would have liked to see is more information about the parents, some more information surrounding the subjects in the study. And maybe like grades. And I say this because in Zemetkin et al. In the 1991 paper, they were so careful to include things like handedness. Are you left or right-handed? How many times have you been to jail? And they include that peripheral information, and I feel like that really helped ease concerns about confounding factors. On the other hand, that paper was performed at a time, that study was performed at a time when ADHD was less known, and they really had to exclude any other confounding factor they possibly could think of. Whereas the paper we're looking at now is in an era where ADHD is very well established, and so they don't need to be as careful. It could be a perfectly fair thing to not include more details than they've already included here. Okay, participants' materials. To test the working memory tasks, or the performance of the working memory of the children, they used a number of different tasks that are well known and are established. So one is the digit span, forwards and backwards, and this is where children are given a sequence of numbers and they're asked to repeat either in ascending or descending order. And the letter number sequencing task, this is where the children are given a sequence of letters and numbers and asked to repeat them back in some sequence. So they might ask you to repeat them in alphabetical order first and then numerical order, something like that. And just so you have a reference, the Wikipedia article seems is pretty comprehensive. And those two tasks, yeah, I'm taking a detour, but I'm going to be doing this a lot for this. So yeah, the digit span and letter number sequencing is a small subset of a much broader set of tests in the Wechsler intelligence scale for children. And it makes sense. This is supposed to be a broad metric for intelligence. And there you go. So I'll link that article, the Wikipedia article, in the description. And apparently this test is this test is reliable according to some metric in a way that's important to these researchers. To measure visuospatial working memory performance, the Corsi or Corsi block tapping test was used, and this helps to see a picture of this. You have a set of blocks that are randomly arranged, and one blips yellow momentarily. You press that yellow button, and it blips. Then 2 blocks blip yellow in sequence, and you do that, and then 3 blocks in sequence, and you press those 3 blocks, and so on. So it becomes a very challenging test as you go up to 5, 6, 7. But it's a good test of working memory. Okay. And then motor performance, they use this MABC2, and this is it's called a movement assessment battery test, and it measures the overall motor performance and separately assesses main motor abilities such as manual dexterity, catching and aiming, and static and dynamic balance. So things like placing pegs with your preferred or non-preferred hand, threading a lace, drawing a trail, catching and aiming, throwing a beanbag onto a mat, things like that. And there's a way to measure how well a child performs given these tasks. Okay, so they have some metric for that. Okay, so we have our subject, our working memory tasks, as well as a way to measure how well the subjects performed in some set of physical tasks. And the procedure, it was done over a 12-week period. Okay, so the two exercise groups did exercise, some kind of exercise once a week over the course of 12 weeks. And the control group, of course, just did nothing. They just lived their lives, but they were tested. So they were tested, all children were tested individually 1 week prior to the start and 1 week after the last session. And children of the exercise groups were also assessed immediately after the first session. So they did this just to see if short-term exercise had benefits on working memory, but something to note is that the exercise groups were actually tested 3 times, and the control groups were tested 2 times. And we'll get back to that. And they describe the exercise program. It's not something, it's not too involved. So each week they do some sort of exercise. And again, exercise group 1 performs very targeted specific tasks. They have a coach for this, so balance training, acrobatics, juggling, some very fine motor skills involved, targeting and throwing. But these are the specific tasks that they wanted to measure related to their prior results. And exercise group 2 did much more broad physical exercises. So swimming, like whole body type movements, climbing, wrestling games, you're using your entire body and with a lot of strength and dexterity, as opposed to just throwing a beanbag onto a mat, right? Okay, that's exercise group 2. For the statistical analysis, I will take it for granted that the authors used these correctly. And typically they do, especially given that this is a sufficiently reputable journal. In the future, so my statistical analysis is a bit weak, and in the future, I'm strongly considering either making a video or just doing a live stream where I go over the different types of statistical tests that are available, and then the different contexts in which they are applied. It'll help me because have worked with experimentalists, and things like ANOVA is a very common, incredibly useful tool. Um, and and then also for you guys, it'll just help if you have some basic literacy in statistical tests or statistical analyses. So it should be a win-win for everyone. And now we move on to the results. This is the main result of the paper. We have the exercise group 1, exercise group 2 control group on the x-axis. Y-axis for this figure is the total working memory score for all the different tasks. I don't know the specifics of how they measured it, but the point is that they included all working memory tasks into a single metric, and that's what's shown in the y-axis. Pre-12 weeks is shown in gray. Okay, gray, and then post-12 weeks is shown in darker gray. And what we see is a statistically significant improvement in working memory in both exercise groups, but no statistically significant increase or change in the control group. This is the main takeaway of the paper. The other takeaway is that there is no difference in the type of physical activity that needs to be done. If you noticed in exercise group 1, the activities were actually very low intensity. So there was things like juggling, throwing a ball, bouncing a ball, and despite that, the researchers found a statistically significant improvement. So that's pretty interesting. And what they do for the rest of the discussion is look at the different types of working memory scores and the physical activity score. And what they find is that in some of the cases for the individual working memory, so they see statistical significance here. That's fine for the digit span forward. The exercise groups increase in their ability to recall digits, but the control group does not. And in some cases, the digit span backward, in this case, there's no statistical significance. So they do mention this, to be fair to them. Right? So there are several significant positive effects. Unfortunately, these effects occurred in a first set of ANOVAs, referring to the first couple figures, but are missing when the groups were analyzed separately. Yeah. So you analyze the group separately according to the task. I believe that's what they mean. And a reason for the lack of significant results in the post-hoc tests could be the low statistical power of the investigation. Okay, so we have 43 subjects split into 3 groups, so you have roughly a dozen per group, and you're trying to establish statistical significance with a group that small, and it's kind of hard to get that to work. Due to this lack of power, we also considered the descriptive results as well as the effect sizes when interpreting the current findings. So they say, so I believe this means, okay, we don't have statistical significance, but we'll just look at the size of the bars with the caveat that it's not statistically significant. Okay, so they fully understand it's not statistically significant, but we'll tentatively, kind of cautiously say, this is what we can glean from the results. And for the most part, for pretty much everything, they see, okay, so letter number sequencing, they see that significant increase. That's great. And then for the catching and aiming, so this is the physical assessment, they see an increase, an improvement, but not a statistical significance there. Okay. And right, so due to no significant differences between the exercise groups, we had to assume that both groups improved equally. This is consistent with a prior study by Sibley and Etnier from 2003, but inconsistent with Buddy et al. 2008, and so this warrants further study. Okay, so those are the results. And I think the results themselves are sound. I think it's safe to assume that the statistical tests are sound. But there are some limitations to be discussed that the authors actually don't mention. Right. I think the discussion of limitations is really itself limited in this paper. There's some bigger picture questions that this paper does not address, but I'll start with some simpler things. So notice that this is figure 4. Figure 4 is the most prominent here. Notice that the pre-digit span forward metric in the control group is far bigger than the performance of the exercise groups prior to that 12-week period. It's huge. And so if the control group performs the same amount, of course there's no change, but look, the control group is performing just as well as the post metrics in the exercise groups. Okay, so I think this is a huge problem. That it seems like the control group, maybe just by chance, happened to have more children that could perform better on for example, the digit span forward task than the exercise groups. So if you had more of the control groups in exercise group 1, for example, they would have started with a higher baseline ability and then ended with this. I assume, it's we don't know, but what if it ended with the same higher baseline performance? So they don't talk about this at all. And in fact, I would say if there's a significant difference between the pre-control group performance and the pre-exercise group performances, which it looks like there might be, that's a huge problem. And that could be related to a smaller sample size. It also could mean that the authors were extremely lucky that they had a control group that, performed this well and then continued to perform that well. Maybe this is accounted for somehow in the study, but I don't know. Okay, and we sort of see that in the overall metric. The pre-control group performs much higher relative to the exercise groups. Again, in the pre-case, we're comparing all the light colors at the moment. And then, so if we had a bunch of these control group children here, we would have the light gray bar would be like this, and it's unclear to me if they would have found statistical significance in that case. Now, to be fair to the authors, of course, it's possible that this control group with exercise would have themselves improved to a much greater post-training, post-test score. But I think that's worth a mention, right? Another thing that I don't know how to answer is the fact that the exercise groups were tested 3 times on the working memory tasks. And these things, if you practice them, you just get better at them. Now, the control groups were tested twice, so that's a very small difference in the number of tests done. And this is a question that I have, I guess, to the authors, which, I mean, they're never going to see this video, but how long does it take for someone to improve at a working memory task at one of these working memory tests? If you do it like 5 times, 10 times, of course, you're going to get better at it, and so your score will improve. But if you test 3 times versus 2, is that difference going to be very significant or not? And I assume probably not. And these tests are well known and well established, and I'm going to assume, I don't know, but I will assume that they're known to be reliable to those types of issues of like retesting. Yeah, that might have been mentioned actually, because they mentioned retesting. But anyways, this comes, okay, so now we arrive at my biggest complaint of this paper. And that has to do with that last sentence in the abstract. The outcomes indicated that regular PA can be used as a physical activity can be used as a complementary or alternative non-pharmacologic treatment for ADHD. The authors are obviously careful to phrase this so that they're not asserting it's true. They're saying it's a potential that physical activity can be used. But this is an incredibly dangerous statement to put in an abstract that's publicly accessible. This paper is closed access, but the abstract is publicly accessible. And a layperson might read this and think, oh, that's great. I can replace all the medication I'm giving to my child with physical activity. And that's just not true. To be able to assert that that's true, not that the authors are asserting it, but to be able to assert it, and I think even to be able to say a tentative statement like that, they would need to have a fourth column showing the performance of neurotypical children. They would have to have a column saying, okay, here's the working memory performance of a neurotypical child. Let's say it's like, it's like here. And compared to that, oh, look, the improvements in working memory of ADHD children doesn't come close to the performance of neurotypical children. Or maybe the metric for neurotypical children is here, and the authors can then confidently say, oh, look, the improvement in working memory actually comes pretty dang close to the neurotypical performance in working memory. But they don't have that, and I take strong issue with that. Another thing they could include is, or I would have really loved to see, this is again bigger picture, another column for neurotypical children before medication, after medication, or sorry, ADHD children before medication and after medication, and look at that improvement in the working memory scores. And does the improvement in working memory with physical exercise come close to the improvements in working memory given medication? What about a combination of those? So these are, again, broader picture. The study itself was not designed to answer those questions, which is fair, but I'm bringing this up specifically because the authors included that ridiculous sentence in the abstract. I take major issue with that. I think it's downright irresponsible. Okay, but that's all I'll say about that. This is my second time recording this video. The first time recorded the entire thing and the audio, my mic wasn't plugged in. So I've had to do this again. And yeah, the whole idea is the same, though. Ending on that note that the authors are just kind of reckless with that, including that statement. So yeah, to conclude, yes, physical exercise does help working memory performance in children with ADHD. But you absolutely cannot conclude in any way that it can be a potential treatment, a potential alternative treatment, or potential replacement for medication, because you do not know how the improvement in cognitive function compares to the improvement in cognitive function. Sorry, you don't know how the improvement in cognitive function given physical activity compares to improvements in cognitive function given medication. All right, but look, great respect to Zereis and Jansen. I think this paper is really good. I did enjoy reading it, and I do appreciate this extensive literature review. And I think the study, again, for what it was set out to do, which was to understand the specific effects of physical activity on specific executive function domains, I think the paper did a decent job of that, given all the constraints that they had. So, yeah. I'll leave it at that. So, all right, I hope this was helpful. I look forward to doing more of these. If you find a paper that's interesting, please let me know. Leave a comment, or go ahead and email me. But yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Take care.